Hey friends, tonight we're traveling back to a time before electricity, before plumbing, before coffee, even before toilet paper, the world of medieval Europe. A place where the word dinner meant something between a prayer and a gamble. This wasn't the age of noble knights and shining banquets. This was the age of spoiled meat, bread like bricks, and beer as breakfast. Survival wasn't guaranteed. Taste wasn't even considered. So, before we dig into the joys of chewing through history, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy sleepy stories about deeply uncomfortable times. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, wrap yourself in something warm, maybe grab a snack, preferably not salted fish, and let's begin tonight's quiet trip into a not-so-gentle past. In medieval Europe, meals didn't come with structure, timing, or the soft ring of a dinner bell. There was no breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, or dinner at 6. There was just food, if you had it, and if it hadn't already spoiled, been stolen, or fed to the pigs. You didn't eat because it was time. You ate because you were hungry, and there happened to be something edible nearby. A crust of bread, a ladle of broth, a cold turnip rolling across the floor. Morning, night, somewhere in between. It didn't matter. Hunger didn't wear a watch. For most people, especially peasants and the urban poor, the idea of a scheduled meal was a fantasy reserved for monasteries or noble halls. Even then, it was less about convenience and more about control. For you, the average medieval soul, food was fuel, and fuel was unpredictable. Sometimes you went a day or two with nothing more than watered-down porridge or a leftover onion. Sometimes you got lucky and a neighbor shared a bit of stew, thin, bland, mostly water, and filled with mystery bits you didn't question. You didn't ask what it was. You asked, is it warm? Is it still here? Is it mine? There were harvest seasons, of course, brief pockets of abundance, but winter stretched long, and storage was unreliable. No freezers, no canned goods, no plastic wrap, just salt, smoke, prayer, and a growing sense of desperation. You might wake up in the night and gnaw on the end of a loaf that had long since gone stale. Hard as wood, rough as sandpaper, but still food. Technically, your teeth might chip. You'd chew anyway. And if you were sick, pregnant, a child with a fever, the meal didn't change. It didn't arrive at your bed. There was no comfort food. You either ate what everyone else did, or not at all. Those raised in the modern world often take for granted how accessible, how timed food has become. Today, meals are rituals. Set, warm, expected. Back then, a meal was a moment of brief, uncelebrated relief. You didn't sit down at a table. You crouched by the fire, if there was one, or on the dirt, or outside, in silence, between chores. And there were no snacks, no second helpings, no post-dinner treats. If you were lucky, the meal filled a corner of your stomach. If you were unlucky, it made you sick. If you were very unlucky, it simply didn't exist. So no, there were no meal times in the Middle Ages, just chances, just hope, and just enough to keep going until the next uncertain bite. Morning comes, not with sunlight, but with cold, the kind that creeps into your bones before you even open your eyes. You sit up slowly, wrapped in a blanket that smells like smoke, sheep, and maybe something else you'd rather not name. Your stomach growls. Time for breakfast, though that word is a bit ambitious. There are no eggs, no toast, no warm pastries or sweet jam. There's just the bread, hard, old, and a little suspicious. It's the same loaf you saw last night, only now it's drier, tougher, and covered in a fine layer of something you brush off and choose not to investigate. Still, it's food. Mostly. You gnaw at a corner like a desperate squirrel. It doesn't bend. It doesn't break easily. But it's edible. Technically. To wash it down? Beer. Not a frothy pint. Not the kind served with music and cheer. This is small beer. Weak. Flat. Barely alcoholic. It's not for enjoyment. It's for survival. Water, in most towns, is a gamble at best and a sentence at worst. Beer has been boiled. Beer is safer. So you drink it warm, flat, and a little sour. Not because you like it, because you need it. Because clean water doesn't come from the stream or the well, it comes from a miracle. This is your breakfast if you're lucky. If you're not, maybe someone else ate the last crust. Maybe the rats found it first. Or maybe there just wasn't any left after last night's meal, which was also mostly bread. You glance around your room. No kitchen. Just a hearth and a shelf with a few sad roots waiting to become soup. You wonder if there might be an egg somewhere. But chickens don't lay in winter, and you haven't seen one in weeks. There's no butter. That's for feast days. There's no fruit. That's for rich people and fairy tales. You chew slowly, pretending the bread is softer, the beer colder, the world kinder. Outside, the village wakes. Hooves clop on mud. Someone's already yelling about firewood. A dog barks. You take another bite. It doesn't taste better the second time. And still, you eat. Because you must. Because hunger doesn't care about variety, and comfort is not on the menu. In medieval Europe, breakfast wasn't the most important meal of the day. It was the only meal some days, a silent ritual of survival, shared by millions, one crust at a time. Lunch, if you could call it that, was less of a break and more of a continuation of surviving. By now, the hard bread from breakfast has settled somewhere in your gut like a brick, and your stomach still grumbles. So, you go to the pot. There's always a pot. Inside is porridge. Oats, mostly, watered down. Salt, if you're lucky. Milk, not likely. Maybe a scrap of onion or cabbage if someone bartered well at market last week. It's grey. It's thin, and it smells like regret. But it's warm, and that's more than most things around here. This is the staple of your life. Porridge, day after day. Not the cozy kind in modern cookbooks with berries and honey. This version sticks to the sides of your bowl and to your expectations. Some days you add root vegetables from the garden. Turnips, beets, leeks, anything that can grow in stubborn soil and survive rain, frost, and neglect. But even these humble treasures are never guaranteed. Because gardens are vulnerable. A single frost can kill the beans. A neighbour's goat might get loose and help itself to your carrots. And then there are thieves. Not the cloaked, mysterious type from stories, but hungry neighbours, children with quick hands, strangers passing through who know the value of a full potato sack. So you hide your harvest under straw. You dig shallow pits in the floor to keep it cool. You check for rot daily. And still, by week's end, something is always gone, or soft, or leaking. Meat? That's for saints' days, weddings or miracles. Maybe a chicken bone boiled until it remembers it was once food. Maybe some scraps from the manor if the Lord's cook is feeling charitable or distracted. But you don't complain. Complaining doesn't make turnips grow faster. You eat what you have. You chew slowly. You make it last. You scrape the pot with a wooden spoon worn down thinner than your patience. When winter comes, everything gets worse. Vegetables shrink, roots freeze, porridge gets thinner. You dream of green things. You dream of butter. You even dream of the cabbage stew from last spring, the one that made everyone slightly ill. You learn not to waste. You learn that soft spots can be cut away, that sour isn't the same as dangerous, that food is not a pleasure, it's an equation, just enough to keep going, not enough to rest. So, if today you have porridge with a bit of leek, and it hasn't gone green yet, that's a feast. That's a win. You eat in silence, watching the wind knock over your drying herbs, and wonder if there'll be anything left for supper. In medieval Europe, food didn't just fill your stomach, it exposed your status, especially when it came to two things, meat and bread. Let's start with bread. Everyone ate it, but what it looked like told the world who you were. If your bread was white, soft, and warm from a real oven, congratulations. You were either a noble, a monk, or someone who worked in a very well-stocked kitchen. White bread was made from fine flour, sifted multiple times. It was expensive, delicate, and mostly reserved for people who didn't have to lift things for a living. If your bread was brown, dark, dense, or full of bits that crunched back, you were like most people, a peasant. Your bread was made from rye, barley, or whatever grain hadn't spoiled. Sometimes it had filler, mashed beans, ground acorns, even dust from the mill floor. It was heavy. It was chewy. It lasted long because no one wanted to eat it quickly. And yes, it occasionally grew a second crust, mold. And then there was meat, the great divider, the feast or the fantasy. To the upper classes, meat was variety: pork, beef, venison, goose, roasted, spiced, stewed, served on platters the size of your table, with sauces that required ingredients shipped in from far-off lands. They didn't just eat meat, they paraded it. A roasted peacock with its feathers sewn back on. A whole pig stuffed with smaller animals. It was performance, a reminder of power. For everyone else, meat was a whisper, a rumor, a small bone boiled 3 times to stretch its essence into soup. Maybe you got offal, liver, heart, kidney, if the butcher had scraps. Maybe you trapped a rabbit, if no one caught you. Maybe, once a year, your family pooled coins to buy a salty slab of pork belly and then rationed it like treasure. Some peasants never ate meat their entire lives, unless you count rats, which, occasionally, were counted. And still, bread and meat did more than feed. They defined. A noble's table was a theatre. Yours was a board balanced on 2 stones. They wiped their fingers with linen. You wiped yours on your tunic. They discussed land, war, marriage. You discussed whether the cabbage had gone sour again. When visitors arrived, they looked at the bread. They looked at the meat. And they knew. They knew exactly where you stood. So yes, 2 foods, bread and meat, 2 mirrors. You stared into yours every day, chewing slowly, trying not to taste the difference. You probably take salt for granted. It sits quietly on your table, next to the pepper. You twist a cap. It rains down. Nothing dramatic, just flavor. But in medieval Europe, salt was power, pepper was wealth, and cinnamon, that was basically currency with a lovely scent. If you were poor, and you were, spices were not part of your reality. Your food tasted like food, or more accurately like whatever the pot, the fire, and time did to it, which usually wasn't much. Salt, when available, was used more to preserve than season. A pinch in your stew was luxury. A sprinkle on bread was extravagance. Entire economies rose and fell on salt. Wars were fought over it. Taxes were levied on it. People went to prison for stealing it. It wasn't seasoning, it was survival. Now imagine pepper, that exotic, faraway dust that had to travel by caravan, ship, and prayer just to reach Europe. If you had pepper in your home, you weren't just wealthy, you were obscenely wealthy. Royals gave it as diplomatic gifts. Nobles locked it in boxes. Some used it to pay debts. 1 ounce could cost days, sometimes weeks, of wages. And then came the truly fantastical flavors: cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, saffron, ginger. These weren't food, these were status symbols. If your meal smelled like a spice market, you either owned land or were preparing food for someone who did. The funny thing is, spices weren't even used for flavor in the way we think now. Medieval nobles often dumped them by the handful into dishes, not to subtly enhance a flavor, but to show they could. A spiced roast wasn't about taste, it was about economics. A mouthful of nutmeg was like wearing silk robes inside out, just so people could see the stitching. As for the poor, you relied on herbs maybe, things that grew wild and weren't yet taxed to death: a bit of parsley, some wild garlic, nettles, sorrel, things that stung or smelled strong. If you were lucky, they added brightness. If not, they reminded you how much you missed actual salt. Sometimes, scraps of spiced meat from noble tables made their way down to servants, then beggars. And in those rare, blessed moments, you might taste something strange and beautiful, and wonder what it was. But it would pass, like all luxuries do. In your world, spices didn't belong in the stew. They belonged in dreams, in myths, in merchant tales whispered by candlelight. So yes, spices were as precious as gold, but unlike gold, you couldn't even hope to see them sparkle. Just inhale faint traces from someone else's feast and keep chewing your turnip. When it came to eating in medieval Europe, you didn't set the table. You didn't fold napkins, light candles, or decide which fork to use for the salad. You didn't even have a fork. Forks, back then, were suspicious, foreign, sometimes even considered sinful. 2 prongs, too close to the devil. If you were rich, and we've established that you weren't, You might have had a personal knife, ornate, polished, tucked into your belt like a jewel. You used it to cut meat, maybe spear something slippery, and most importantly, to show off. Knives were status. The fewer teeth you had, the more elegant your knife skills had to be. If you were poor, and you didn't get your own knife. There might be one knife on the table, passed around, wiped, maybe, and used again. Sometimes you didn't get a turn. The food was soft enough. You just tore it with your hands, dunked it in broth, and hoped your fingernails were cleaner than they looked. Spoons existed, sort of. They were usually made of wood. The bowl might be shallow, the handle often chewed at one end, from boredom, anxiety, or the dog. In some households, there was only one spoon, and it went to the head of the family. Everyone else? You slurped straight from the bowl, or tilted it and hoped gravity helped. And plates? Not really. If you had bread, that was your plate. It soaked up juices, held scraps, and was sometimes eaten at the end, or thrown to the animals. Rich people had trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread or carved wood. Poor people had whatever surface was cleanish. The table, a piece of bark, the floor. Most eating, then, was done with hands. Greasy, soot-covered, work-worn hands. You scooped, pinched, tore, dipped. Meals were tactile, messy, shared. You didn't worry about double dipping. You worried about getting your share before someone else's hand got there first. And hygiene? There was water, somewhere. Soap was for laundry, when it existed. You wiped your fingers on your tunic, or your neighbor's sleeve, or a passing dog. Table manners were flexible. Meals weren't elegant. They were functional, fast, loud, sometimes chaotic. You didn't linger at the table. You didn't talk about flavor notes. You chewed, swallowed, wiped your mouth on your sleeve, and went back to whatever job was breaking your spine that day. So no, there were no 5-piece cutlery sets, no etiquette classes, just hunger, shared bowls, and fingers that did most of the work. Because in the Middle Ages, your hands weren't just tools, they were your utensils, your napkin, your claim to dinner, and your only guarantee you'd get fed. In medieval Europe, what you ate, and more importantly what you didn't, wasn't just up to your appetite or your pantry. It was up to God, or rather, to his representatives, who had very strong opinions about meat, milk, and your eternal soul. The church didn't just guide morality, it also organized your stomach. The year was carved up by holy days, feast days, saints' days, and, most significantly, fast days. And there were a lot of them. How many? About half the year. No, that's not an exaggeration. On average, you spent over 150 days a year under food restrictions, and not just skipping dessert. These were full dietary rules: no meat, no dairy, no eggs, and sometimes no pleasure at all. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, certain vigils, all fast days, which meant, essentially, say goodbye to anything remotely filling or tasty. No bacon, no butter, no cheese, no eggs, no milk, definitely no roast anything. Instead, you had fish, but not the grilled salmon you're imagining. Think salted herring, dried cod, pickled eels, food that could survive a sea voyage and still be legally considered edible, the kind of fish that crumbled like old parchment and smelled like defeat. Of course, the rich bent the rules. They always do. Monks and nobles found creative loopholes. Beavers, for example, were declared fish by some church authorities because they lived in water. So yes, people ate beaver tails during fasts. Logic? Thin? Commitment? Impressive. The poor had fewer options, and fewer beavers. They followed the rules more closely, not out of piety, but because they couldn't afford the food that broke them anyway. And the church didn't stop at ingredients. There were even restrictions on how often you could eat during fast days. 1 meal a day, maybe 2 if you were sick or elderly, or rich and persuasive. Snacking? A sin. Buttering your bread? Dangerous ground. Smiling while chewing? Possibly suspicious. You might think fasting was spiritual, and it was, on paper, but in practice, it was logistical. It shaped markets, trade routes, seasonal planning. Entire communities adjusted their agriculture and storage around what the church calendar allowed. So you learned to eat lean. You salted fish in summer, dried peas in spring, and boiled vegetables into mush all year long. You chewed slowly, not for taste, but because there wasn't much to chew. Fasting wasn't a choice. It was a calendar reminder that your hunger, like everything else, belonged to someone else. So yes, while modern life gives you brunch on Sundays and cheat days on Fridays, in the medieval world, you stared at a pot of grey soup and thanked the saints it wasn't worse. And then you said grace, because it might be the last thing you taste today that didn't come with guilt. In the modern world, food goes in the fridge. You seal it in plastic, set a timer, and trust the quiet hum of your appliances to keep everything fresh and edible. In the medieval world, there was no fridge, no freezer, no Tupperware. Just salt, smoke, darkness, and the deep, desperate hope that winter stayed cold enough to keep your meat from turning green. Preserving food wasn't convenience, it was survival. Because harvests didn't last, markets closed early, and once winter arrived, nothing grew except mold and regret. So when you had food, you had to make it last. Somehow, salt was king. Salted pork, salted fish, salted beans, anything you could rub or soak in salt until it resembled a mineral deposit. It worked, mostly. The texture suffered. So did the taste. But the food didn't rot right away, and that counted as a win. Smoke was next. Smoking fish, sausage, or strips of meat gave them a fighting chance against time. If you had a chimney or a hearth, you had a smokehouse. Sort of. The results were usually tough, dry, and tasted more like the firewood than the animal. But again, it kept you from starving, which made it delicious by default. Then there was drying. Fruits, herbs, mushrooms, even strips of root vegetables hung near the rafters, soaking in warmth and dust. If they shriveled into something vaguely edible by winter, you had yourself a stew ingredient. If not, well, you had string decorations. Pickling? Sure, vinegar was used, when you had it, not for tang or flavor, but because acid made things last, sort of. Pickled cabbage, pickled eggs, pickled anything that didn't escape fast enough. And when you didn't have salt, smoke, or vinegar, you relied on nature, cold air, frozen ground, a hole in the floor. You buried turnips, you stacked apples in hay. You hung sausages from beams and prayed the rats were busy somewhere else. Sometimes the food spoiled anyway. Sometimes it looked fine, smelled fine, and still made you sick. You learned to sniff deeply, chew slowly, and listen to your gut, literally. If it gurgled in warning, you stopped eating. If not, you finished fast before it changed its mind. You also learned to adjust your standards. A little mold? Cut it off. A sour smell? Boil it longer. A slimy texture? Add more oats. Everything could be salvaged, or at least disguised. Food preservation wasn't science. It was ritual, instinct, and hope. Hope that the barrel didn't leak, that the root cellar stayed dry, that the meat hanging in the smoke didn't disappear overnight. So yes, no refrigerators, no labels, no guarantees, just salt, smoke, and the prayer that winter air stayed bitter enough to keep your dinner from killing you. And even then, you chewed carefully. You didn't eat alone in the Middle Ages, even when no one else was at the table, because where there was food, there were insects. Always. Flies, fleas, beetles, weevils, worms, maggots, each with their own way of showing up unannounced and refusing to leave. If your stew smelled off, if your bread had holes, if your flour looked like it moved ever so slightly, you probably weren't imagining it. You had company. Start with the bread. It wasn't factory sealed. It wasn't even fully clean. Grain storage was rudimentary. Bins, sacks, barrels, often shared with mice, damp air, and families of weevils. By the time you milled it into flour, there was more than grain inside. Tiny white specks that wiggled if you looked too long. Some people sifted them out. Most didn't bother. It added texture. Then came the meat, when you had any. If it wasn't fresh, and it rarely was, it might already be halfway claimed by flies. A quick rinse, a good boil, a strong stomach. That was your defense. Maggots were not exactly rare. In some cases, they were expected. Salt helped. Smoke helped. But still, when you unwrapped that pork belly and something squirmed, You just cut around it. Even vegetables had their guests. Root crops came with dirt, and dirt came with bugs. You washed them, if water was available. If not, you rubbed them on your sleeve and hoped for the best. A worm in a carrot? Extra protein? A beetle in the cabbage? Remove and stir. Then there were flies, constant, casual, confident. They hovered over every pot, landed on every crust, and sometimes drowned in soup with no apology. You fished them out. You kept eating. If you stopped for every bug, you'd starve before supper. In the summer, it was worse. Hot weather meant more rot, more smells, more bugs. You covered food with cloth, thin, hole-ridden cloth, that might stop a tired fly but not a determined one. Meat was hung high to keep it away from crawling things, but rats climbed, and flies flew, and cockroaches simply waited. And while you ate, you scratched. Fleas and lice were as present as spoons, maybe more so. They didn't care if you were rich or poor. But poor people had fewer changes of clothes, fewer chances to bathe, and more places for bugs to live. You shared your food with insects on the plate, and insects on yourself. No one screamed. No one panicked. This was normal. You were outnumbered. You got used to it. You chewed carefully, didn't look too close, and tried not to think about what crunched. So yes, meals were shared. Not by invitation, but by infestation. Because in the medieval world, you weren't just feeding yourself. You were feeding whoever showed up first. Most days in medieval life were about scraping by. Barely enough food, barely enough time to eat it, and never enough reason to smile while chewing. But every so often, something changed. The bells rang louder, the streets filled, the air smelled different. Something was roasting. It was festival day. Religious feast days, saints' days, harvest festivals, weddings, these were the only times when food felt like more than just survival. For a few golden hours, the pot was full, the fire was hot, and the meat was real. These meals weren't daily occurrences. They were events, prepared for days, even weeks. Ingredients were pooled. Chickens were caught. Bread was baked fresh. White bread, if you could imagine. Vegetables were chopped in quantities larger than 1 turnip per person. Honey was drizzled, not just dreamed of. And somewhere, a whole pig turned slowly over a fire, the scent curling through the village like a rumour of happiness. Music played. Ale flowed. People smiled while eating, a rare and deeply suspicious thing. If you were poor, and you were, you probably didn't host the feast, but you might have helped prepare it, served it, cleaned up after it. And if you were lucky, really lucky, someone handed you a plate, or a bone, or a ladle of thick stew with more than just broth. You ate slowly, not out of manners, but because you wanted to remember what chewing real meat felt like. You soaked up gravy with bread that didn't break your teeth. You drank ale that wasn't flat or bitter. You maybe even got second helpings. These meals weren't just food, they were theatre. Dishes appeared that had names. Sauces with spices you'd only heard about in stories. Jellied things, stuffed birds, coloured pastries shaped like fish or saints or symbols no one quite recognized. Were they delicious? Maybe. Were they excessive? Definitely. But for a moment, you saw what life could taste like if it didn't constantly try to kill you. And of course, it ended. The fire died down. The pig was bones. The bread was crumbs. The ale barrel coughed its last. You went home with grease on your fingers and the unfamiliar feeling of being full. The next day, back to porridge. Back to bread so stale it echoed when tapped. But now, at least, you had a memory, a vision of warmth, meat, laughter. And that memory had to last, because no one knew when the next festival would come. And until then, food went back to being quiet, bland, and a little bit terrifying. So yes, festivals were more than celebration. They were brief glimpses of abundance, rationed joy, edible proof that life wasn't always grey. Just mostly. You might think hunger was the biggest danger at the medieval table, but the real threat wasn't always not eating. Sometimes, the real danger came after the first bite. Because in the Middle Ages, food could kill you. Quietly, slowly, horribly. Start with bread, the most basic, dependable staple. Except it wasn't always safe. Grain, when stored badly, which was often, grew mold, not the fuzzy green kind you scrape off toast. We're talking ergot, a toxic fungus that clung to rye and barley. Eat enough of it, and you wouldn't just feel sick, you'd hallucinate, convulse, or lose fingers to gangrene. Entire villages were struck down by it. They called it holy fire, though there was nothing holy about vomiting and watching your hands turn black. Then there was meat when you had it. If fresh, it spoiled quickly. If salted, it could still harbour disease. If cooked, it was often underdone, especially if fuel was scarce. You didn't have thermometers. You didn't even have certainty. You just hoped the pink bit in the middle wasn't plotting something. Milk, warmed on its own, sour by sunset, unpasteurized of course, and stored in clay jugs beside the fire or under the bed. It curdled, it separated, and sometimes it crawled. People drank it anyway. And water, the simplest need of all, was the riskiest of them all. Wells were shared by humans, animals, runoff, and occasionally a drowned rat. Streams were toilets. Rainwater was storage, complete with whatever fell in overnight. Boiling helped, if you had time, firewood, or remembered to do it. Even vegetables carried risk. Grown in manure-heavy soil, eaten raw rarely, or stored too long, they could rot from the inside out. You'd bite into what looked like a turnip, only to find something soft, sour, and faintly buzzing. Preservation methods were inconsistent. Sometimes meat was too lightly salted. Sometimes it was hung too long. Sometimes you ate something you shouldn't, because the smell was off, but you were too hungry to care. And no one warned you. Labels didn't exist. Expiration dates hadn't been invented. Safety guidelines were just smell it, squint at it, and hope. If your stomach churned afterward, that was either divine punishment or poor timing. Food didn't just lack nutrition, it lacked mercy. One bad stew could take out a household. One shady sausage could lay you flat for days. So yes, you ate less, but more importantly, you ate cautiously, slowly, prayerfully. Because in medieval Europe, dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a test of trust. Trust in your nose, trust in the cook, trust in luck. And most of all, trust that today's meal wouldn't become tomorrow's eulogy. In the medieval world, food was never just food. It was fuel, it was fortune, and it was risk. You didn't eat because it was mealtime. You ate because your body demanded it, and because something edible hadn't been stolen, spoiled, or swarming. Each meal was a silent wager. You stared into a bowl of grey porridge or sniffed at a hunk of meat that looked slightly too shiny and asked yourself, will this keep me alive, or end the day early? Most of the time, the answer was probably fine, but probably didn't inspire confidence. Still, you were too tired, too hungry, and too poor to say no. You rolled the dice every time you swallowed. Was that sausage made this week? Or last month? Did the salt preserve it? Or just mask something worse? Was the bread slightly sour, or softly poisonous? You didn't know. No one did. And still, you ate. Because not eating wasn't an option either. Hunger wasn't poetic. It was grinding, dull, and merciless. It made your bones ache. It blurred your thoughts. It made you careless enough to eat what you shouldn't. You didn't have choices. You had bowls, buckets, loaves that needed a chisel, stew that tasted like boiled memory. You had food, or you didn't. That was it. And even when it didn't kill you, it didn't comfort you. Food rarely brought joy. It didn't warm the soul. It didn't remind you of childhood. It reminded you that life was short, full of coughing, and ruled by what grew, what didn't rot, and what you could hold on to long enough to chew. Eating wasn't celebration. It was strategy. You planned around famine. You rationed leftovers. You saved the clean spoon for feast days. You shared, carefully, and you prayed over bowls, not out of gratitude, but out of fear. Sometimes you laughed while eating. Sometimes you choked. Sometimes both. You learned to chew through silence, through illness, through grief. Because dinner couldn't wait for peace. It barely waited for fuel. And if someone asked what you had for supper, you didn't list ingredients. You said, I got through it. That was enough. That was everything. Because in a time when survival wasn't promised, Every meal was a gamble, and every swallow a small act of courage. So, after 12 courses of mouldy bread, thin porridge, salted mystery meat, and maggots where maggots really shouldn't be, ask yourself honestly, would you survive a single day in the Middle Ages? Probably not, and that's okay. Because medieval life wasn't built for comfort. It wasn't designed for flavor, hygiene, or digestive peace. It was built on necessity, on improvisation, on the constant, exhausting game of staying alive long enough to be hungry again. There were no refrigerators, no takeout, no, what do you feel like eating tonight? Just hands, fire, salt, sometimes hope. And yet, people did survive. Somehow, they raised families, shared scraps, made feasts out of famine. They cooked with what they had, and ate with who they could. They passed bowls, not menus. So the next time your toast is slightly burnt, or your latte isn't quite the right temperature, remember, at least you're not chewing beet soup in a clay bowl, praying it doesn't bite back. Eating in the Middle Ages wasn't about enjoyment, it was about endurance. And if you've made it this far, listening in the dark, letting your eyes close slowly, then maybe you've endured a little with them. Sleep well, and tomorrow, eat something soft. Aspasia was not born in Athens, which was the first strike against her. She came from Miletus, a bustling Ionian city far from the stony hills and dusty forums of Athens. In the 5th century BCE, being born in Miletus made you a metic in Athens, a foreign resident, tolerated, but never fully accepted. No matter how long you lived there, how fluent your Greek was, or how many great men you knew, you would never be a citizen. You would always be an outsider. That was the law. And Athens loved its laws almost as much as it loved its philosophy. Now, being a foreigner in Athens was one thing, being a woman was another, and being a woman who spoke out loud, in public, with opinions, well, that was an entirely different matter. In classical Athens, respectable women were not seen in the agora, the bustling heart of public life. They were not educated in philosophy or rhetoric. They didn't go to symposia, they didn't engage in public discussion, and they certainly didn't teach men. They stayed at home, behind high courtyard walls, weaving and raising children, and if they were mentioned at all in polite society, it was better to be said to be invisible. A famous quote from Pericles himself, Aspasia's future partner, stated that the greatest glory of a woman was to be least talked about, whether for good or for ill. Aspasia didn't exactly follow that advice. Details about her early life are scarce, whispered through layers of myth and memory. We don't know the name of her mother, nor the exact circumstances of her arrival in Athens. But we know this. By the time she appeared in the historical record, Aspasia was already unusual. She was educated, articulate, and not shy. Some sources say she had studied rhetoric. Others hint that she had travelled widely, perhaps even learned from philosophers themselves. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. She was not like the other women in Athens. In a city where most women were expected to remain quiet, Aspasia read, wrote, and spoke, and she did so around men. This was, for the time, borderline scandalous. But Aspasia didn't stop there. She didn't just speak, she engaged. She debated. She questioned. She formed ideas and shared them. It is said that philosophers and politicians would gather at her home not just to admire her beauty, though that is often mentioned, but to hear her opinions. She didn't live in the shadows. She didn't ask for permission. And for all that, she was never truly welcome. To the Athenians, Aspasia was a paradox, a woman who behaved like a philosopher, a foreigner who moved in circles of power, an outsider who did not stay in her place. To modernize, that might sound admirable, even courageous, but to conservative Athens, it was confusing, unnerving, and perhaps a little dangerous. She wasn't just a woman who spoke, she was a woman who thought. And that, in ancient Athens, was enough to turn heads, and not always in a good way. There is no evidence Aspasia ever tried to become a citizen. She couldn't, anyway. The laws would not have allowed it. But neither did she disappear into the background, accept her silence, or become just another unnamed figure behind a great man. Instead, she carved out a space where there wasn't one. Not on the stage. Not in the council chambers. but in the quiet center of conversation, in salons of the mind, where her voice could still be heard, even if history tried, again and again, to forget it. Athens, for all its brilliance, was not built for women like Aspasia. It was a city that admired wisdom, but only in certain forms, from certain mouths. It was a city that gave the world democracy, but not to half its population. Aspasia lived in that contradiction, not as a protester or rebel, not as a queen or conqueror, but simply as a woman who refused to be silent. She was born far from Athens, and centuries too early, but somehow she found her way in. And whether they liked it or not, they had to listen. In ancient Athens, there were many kinds of women: wives, daughters, mothers, servants, but none were quite as misunderstood as the hetairai, a special class of courtesans. Not prostitutes in the modern sense, nor wives in the traditional one, hetairai lived in a strange space between admiration and suspicion. They were free in ways most women were not, and that freedom came at a cost. Aspasia was one of them, or at least, that is what many sources suggest. She was a hetairai, but not the kind you might be imagining. In Athens, the role of the respectable woman was limited. She stayed indoors, unseen and unheard. She was meant to manage the home, raise children, and avoid public life altogether. Her value was tied to modesty and silence. Hetairai, on the other hand, lived outside that mold. They could attend symposia, elite dinner parties where wine flowed and conversations turned philosophical. They could speak with men, argue with them, even teach them. They could be educated, witty, opinionated. In fact, they were expected to be. Men paid not only for their beauty, but for their company, for conversation, cleverness, and presence of mind. It was scandalous. It was powerful. It was dangerous. Aspasia moved through this space with surprising grace. She wasn't hidden away like the wives of the elite. She was part of the conversation, literally. Her home became a kind of intellectual salon, where thinkers and politicians gathered not just to look at her, but to listen to her. Some said she taught rhetoric, the art of persuasion. Others whispered that she trained men in the art of public speaking, maybe even helped compose speeches for them. Still others accused her of having too much influence, of pulling strings behind the scenes. None of this would have been said of a wife. None of this would have been allowed of a citizen. But Aspasia was neither. She was a hetairai, which meant she was not confined by the expectations of marriage or family, but also not protected by their respectability. She could speak freely, but that freedom left her vulnerable. She had independence, but no safety net. To some Athenians, she was fascinating. To others, she was terrifying. A woman who was beautiful and smart, a woman who wasn't afraid to think, or worse, to argue. For many men, it wasn't a fantasy, it was a problem. Aspasia didn't fit neatly into the roles that society had prepared for her. She wasn't a wife, she wasn't a concubine, she wasn't a citizen, she wasn't silent. She existed in a grey space. And for most of Athenian society, grey spaces were uncomfortable. They preferred categories, good or bad, pure or impure, public or private. Aspasia defied those boundaries simply by existing where she wasn't supposed to. She never claimed to be a revolutionary. She didn't call for laws to change. She didn't shout in the streets. But by living as she did, educated, articulate, influential, she challenged the invisible walls that surrounded most women. And of course, she was judged for it. Not always openly, not always with direct attacks, but with suspicion, with whispers, with small accusations tucked into the writings of men. With lines like, "She must have used her charms," or "She had unnatural sway over great men." In other words, how could a woman like her do what she did, unless she had tricked someone? It couldn't be skill, it couldn't be thought, it couldn't be intellect. And yet, again and again, men kept showing up at her door to talk, to listen, to learn. She was a hetairai, yes, but not the kind many Athenians preferred to believe in. She was not decoration. She was not indulgence. She was not fantasy. She was conversation. She was intellect. She was unsettling. In a society that wanted its women silent and its foreigners small, Aspasia was both loud and large. And for that, Athens could never quite forgive her. Pericles was not just any Athenian, he was Athens, the man behind its golden age, its most famous buildings, and its greatest military victories. A statesman, a strategist, and an orator, with a voice so persuasive it could sway an entire assembly. He was composed, logical, almost stoic, a leader admired for his intellect, feared for his discipline. He rarely smiled, rarely lost his temper, and rarely let emotion interfere with policy. Until he met Aspasia. We do not know how they met. History, full of its usual gaps and shadows, leaves us only fragments. But by the time Aspasia appears clearly in the records, she is already close to him. Not as a wife, Athens did not allow foreigners to marry citizens, but as a partner, a presence, a woman he loved, lived with, and never seemed to let go. This, in itself, was scandalous. Pericles was a citizen of the highest rank. He could have married anyone from a noble Athenian family. Instead, he divorced his legal wife, a respectable, silent woman, chosen through proper custom, and chose Aspasia, the foreign-born hetera. They lived together publicly, as if married, even though no law would recognize their union. For some, this was proof of his moral failing. For others, it was proof of something else, that he had fallen under her spell. They began to whisper, "Pericles isn't leading Athens anymore. Aspasia is." This was not just idle gossip. In 451 BCE, under Pericles' leadership, Athens passed a new citizenship law. From that point forward, only those born to two Athenian parents could be citizens. Not just the father, both parents. The law was strict, precise, and deeply nationalistic. It was meant to protect the purity of Athenian identity. It was also, perhaps, a line drawn in the sand. Because when Aspasia gave birth to Pericles' son, the law meant that child would not be a citizen of the city his father led. This irony did not go unnoticed. Pericles, the architect of the rule, now lived outside of it. His own son was a metic, like Aspasia, like all foreigners, like all those who would never be permitted to vote, to speak in the assembly, or to inherit their father's name. Some say Pericles regretted the law. Others say he never intended for Aspasia to bear him a child. Still, others believe it was his way of protecting the state, even at the cost of his family. But whatever his reasons, the law stood, and his son, Pericles the Younger, remained a non-citizen. At least, for a while. Years later, as war and plague ravaged Athens, Pericles would appeal to the assembly to make an exception. His two legitimate sons from his earlier marriage had died in the plague. Only Aspasia's son remained. Pericles stood before the people, proud, tired, desperate, and asked them to grant citizenship to the boy who was his last heir. Remarkably, they agreed. Pericles the Younger was made an Athenian citizen and would later go on to become a general himself. But the gesture was not just political, it was personal. A rare moment when the law, so often rigid and abstract, bent under the weight of human attachment. Through all of this, Aspasia remained by Pericles' side. When political enemies attacked him, they attacked her too. She was accused of impiety, of corrupting morals, even of influencing state policy with her feminine wiles. Some of these accusations were brought to trial. Most were never proven. But the intent was clear, to weaken Pericles by attacking the woman he loved. And yet, he never abandoned her. Even as his popularity waned, even as war consumed the city, Pericles stood by Aspasia, not because it was easy, but because he wanted to. To Athens, this was more than a romance. It was a break in the natural order, a man of reason, undone by emotion, a leader, swayed by a woman. To Aspasia, perhaps, it was simply life as she had always known it, somewhere on the edge of acceptance, always balancing admiration and suspicion. She did not ask Pericles to change the world for her, but in small, undeniable ways, he did. And in a city where women were not meant to be heard, where love was rarely part of politics, Aspasia left her mark not through revolution, but through quiet influence, and a bond strong enough to alter the laws of the land. Ancient Athens was a city that prided itself on its thinkers. It gave the world Plato and Socrates, Aristotle and Xenophon, names still etched into the pillars of philosophy over 2,000 years later. Men sat in shaded courtyards and argued about justice, virtue, the soul, and the ideal state. They questioned the gods. They questioned reality. They even questioned themselves. But what they didn't question, or rather, refused to, was whether women had a place in those conversations. To most philosophers of the classical world, the answer was clear: they did not. The ideal Athenian woman was modest, quiet, and preferably invisible. She did not speak in public. She did not enter debates. She did not teach, and she certainly did not correct men. The home was her domain, not the agora. Philosophy, politics, and rhetoric, these were for men. So when Aspasia appeared, she disrupted more than just social norms. She stepped into a space that had been carefully protected, and she didn't do it loudly or aggressively. She did it by simply being present and intelligent. Aspasia talked. She engaged in philosophical dialogue. She asked questions. She responded to arguments. She offered her own. And she did it not from behind a curtain or in hushed voices at home, but in open conversation, sometimes with the most prominent men in Athens. According to some sources, she even taught rhetoric. There are whispers, never confirmed, always debated, that Socrates himself visited her home to listen, to learn, that he admired her intellect, her way of speaking, her influence over Pericles. Some writers even suggest that Socrates credited her with shaping the rhetorical skills of men who would later shape the city. Of course, these are just whispers. They do not appear in the grand texts of philosophy. Aspasia's name is not chiseled into stone beside theirs, but the rumors remained, and that, in itself, is telling. A woman who could outtalk a philosopher, who could teach them how to speak. Unthinkable. And yet, somehow, true enough to bother people for centuries. In Plato's Menexenus, a short and strange dialogue, Socrates jokingly attributes a funeral oration to Aspasia, claiming she composed it, and even taught him how to deliver it. Scholars still debate whether Plato meant this as satire, admiration, or something in between, but the fact that he chose Aspasia, of all people, to put into the mouth of Socrates is a clue. A clue that, even among the philosophers, she had a presence that could not be ignored. But not everyone was amused. For many, Aspasia represented something uncomfortable, not just because she was a woman, but because she was a woman who refused to play the role assigned to her. She wasn't quiet. She wasn't deferential. She didn't hide behind a powerful man. Instead, she stood beside him, sometimes ahead of him. This challenged the order of things. In a society that believed the best women were silent, a woman who could speak, and speak well, was not admired. She was feared. She was mocked. She was accused of manipulation, of witchcraft, of seduction. Surely, they reasoned, she must be using tricks. No ordinary woman could speak like that. No respectable woman would. Some of the same men who wrote long treatises on logic and virtue had very little patience for Aspasia. They dismissed her with a sentence or two. Others didn't mention her at all. The silence is telling. But silence didn't erase her. Even without her own writings, none have survived if they ever existed. Aspasia left a trail, a faint imprint on the edges of philosophical thought. A woman whose mind stirred the minds of others, even if they preferred not to admit it. She asked questions. She debated. She taught. And for that, philosophers, men who claimed to value reason above all, found her deeply inconvenient. Because reason, when it came from a woman, wasn't reason anymore. It was danger. Aspasia never tried to overthrow Athens. She didn't demand a place in the assembly or the academy. She simply spoke. That was all. But in that time, in that place, it was enough to disturb the foundations. She was not born to be a philosopher, but she made philosophers listen, and some of them never forgave her for it. Aspasia didn't stand in the assembly. She never held a formal office, never commanded troops, never cast a vote. By Athenian law, she couldn't place. She wasn't a citizen. She wasn't a man. But still, somehow, she shaped ideas. And that's what made her dangerous. Aspasia's true power didn't lie in laws or titles. It lived in conversation. Her home, by many accounts, became something more than a residence. It became a quiet center of intellectual life, not official, not advertised, but known, a place where philosophers, poets, and politicians came to speak and to listen. They didn't come for music or for food. They came for words, for thought, for discussion. And in the middle of it all was Aspasia, asking questions, steering conversations, offering her own thoughts on ethics, power, and war. It was a kind of salon, centuries before the term existed. But unlike the courts of France or the drawing rooms of Enlightenment Europe, this one existed in a city where women weren't supposed to speak in public at all. And yet, she spoke. In a society where public speech was the highest form of power, where rhetoric shaped war and peace, life and death, Aspasia didn't just join the conversation, she taught others how to join it too. She is believed to have taught rhetoric to some of the most important men of her time, not officially, not in any academy, but personally, intimately, one mind passing knowledge to another. Some even say she helped Pericles craft his speeches, that her hands were in the very words that echoed across the Pnyx and stirred the hearts of citizens. That the funeral oration, one of the most famous speeches in Western history, bore traces of her thinking, if not her phrasing. These are just theories, of course. We have no manuscripts, no lectures, no signed dialogues. Only fragments, footnotes, suggestions made by men who perhaps weren't quite ready to give full credit to the woman who stood behind, or perhaps beside, greatness. Still, the rumors persisted. Socrates himself, according to some sources, praised Aspasia's ability to teach the art of persuasion. He may have admired her eloquence, even learned from it. There are stories, half mocking, half admiring, of her instructing men in the delicate mechanics of speech, how to speak clearly, convincingly, with presence. For a woman to teach that, in that time, in that place, was a quiet kind of revolution. Aspasia didn't fight battles, she didn't storm temples, but she challenged ideas. She challenged the idea that women were empty vessels, that foreigners had no role in Athenian greatness, that beauty and intelligence could not exist in the same person. And the most unsettling thing? She did it calmly, without outrage, without shouting. She didn't beg for a seat at the table, she simply acted as if she had one. There's something profoundly threatening about a person who acts freely in a society built on rules. Aspasia broke no laws, and yet she broke expectations every time she opened her mouth. She asked things no one asked. What makes a just war? What is a woman's place in virtue? What is the purpose of rhetoric? Is power always loud? Is silence always weakness? She lived her questions, and, perhaps unknowingly, she became one. Even the way she taught was radical. In conversation, not instruction. In intimacy, not authority. Her lessons weren't meant for the masses. They were passed between people, woven into dialogue, impossible to trace, but hard to erase. Some found this compelling, others found it intolerable. Because if Aspasia could teach great men how to speak, what else might she teach them? Could she make them question their city, their traditions, their gods? Could she make them think? For a world obsessed with order, that was too much. And so, they whispered, they accused, they minimized, they erased. But they couldn't undo her presence, or her effect. We don't know exactly what Aspasia said. We don't know exactly what she taught. But we know it mattered, because it survived. Not in writing, not in monuments, but in memory, in tension, in the uneasy praise of her enemies. She said what no one else would, and taught what no one else dared. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change the world, or to be remembered by it. For most people in classical Athens, being brought to trial was not uncommon. Citizens sued one another frequently, over land, over inheritance, over contracts and insults. But for Aspasia, her trial was something far stranger. She wasn't accused of theft or treason, she was accused of impiety, of offending the gods. In a deeply religious city like Athens, this was no small matter. The gods weren't distant figures. They were everywhere, in the temples, in the markets, in the seasons, and in the laws. Offending them wasn't just a spiritual failure, it was a threat to the state itself. A city that angered the gods could fall to plague, to famine, to war. And so, Athenians watched each other carefully, always on guard for signs of disrespect. Still, it wasn't every day that a woman, a foreign-born woman, was formally accused of such a crime. We don't know the exact details of the charge. The records, as usual, are incomplete. Some say Aspasia was accused of introducing new deities. Others claim she mocked the traditional rites. Still others suggest it was her influence over Pericles that drew the accusation that she had corrupted him and, through him, the city. Whatever the reason, the outcome was clear. Aspasia was put on trial, and the city watched. The timing wasn't accidental. This happened during a period of rising political tension. Athens was preparing for war, and Pericles, her closest companion, was at the center of it all. He had enemies, rivals in the assembly, who wanted to weaken his hold on power, and they could not attack him directly, but they could go after someone close to him. Aspasia was an easy target. She was not a citizen. She had no political rights. She couldn't defend herself in the assembly, or vote, or call witnesses of her own, but her presence was impossible to ignore. And her connection to Pericles made her more than just a woman, it made her a symbol. The charge of impiety had been used before. Years earlier, it had brought down Anaxagoras, the philosopher who taught that the sun was a fiery stone, not a god. It would later be used again, most famously against Socrates, who was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the divine. For Aspasia, the stakes were no less severe. Conviction could mean exile. It could mean disgrace. In the worst cases, it could mean execution. And yet, she stood trial. Some say she defended herself with calm and clarity. Others say she broke into tears, pleading for mercy. There is no way to know which version is true. But one thing is clear. Pericles did something rare, something few Athenian men had ever done. He spoke for her. He, the greatest orator of Athens, stood in court and defended the woman he loved. He argued not only for her innocence, but for her integrity, for her mind, her loyalty, her right to exist in the city she had never truly belonged to. This was not just romantic, it was radical. In Athens, even citizen women were rarely defended publicly, let alone foreign-born heterae, and yet here was Pericles, leader of the city, risking his reputation for her. It worked. Aspasia was acquitted. She returned home. There were no punishments, no exile, no formal stain on her name, but the message had been sent. She had been warned. She may have won the trial, but she had also been put in her place, and from then on, she lived under quiet suspicion. No longer just the brilliant woman beside a great man, now also the woman who had once been judged by the city's gods. Still, she stayed. She did not flee Athens. She did not retreat into silence. She remained where she had always been, in the background of the world's most public man, in the minds of those who had once tried to erase her. Her trial didn't break her, but it revealed something essential about Athens. For all its love of reason, it feared what it couldn't control. And Aspasia, with her questions, her confidence, and her refusal to be quiet, would never be easy to control. In a city ruled by law and legend, she had faced both, and survived. Athens was never the same after the war began. In 431 BCE, the Peloponnesian War broke out, a long, bitter struggle between Athens and Sparta. It dragged on for decades, claiming lives, draining wealth, and testing the city's spirit. It was not a war of quick victories or glorious charges. It was a war of attrition, of blockades, of cities burned, and treaties broken. In the second year of that war, something even more devastating arrived: plague. No one knows exactly what disease it was. Some say typhus, others say smallpox, or even Ebola-like symptoms. What's known is that it struck hard and fast, sweeping through the crowded streets of Athens like fire in dry grass. No god was able to stop it. No physician could cure it. Families vanished in days. Entire neighborhoods went quiet. And among the dead were Pericles' 2 sons from his earlier marriage. Then, soon after, Pericles himself. He, the man who had built Athens into an empire of ideas and monuments, succumbed to the same invisible force that had claimed the common poor. There was no parade, no shining farewell. Just a slow, painful death, likely in the arms of the woman who had stood beside him for decades. And then, he was gone. The world that Aspasia had moved within, the salons of thinkers, the debates of politicians, the oratory of empire, faded around her. Most stories about great men end when the man dies, but Aspasia's story did not. She remained. Not exiled, not silenced, not erased, just still there. We don't know exactly what happened to her in the years that followed. There are few records. The historians who wrote about generals and battles had little interest in the quiet endurance of a woman without official title. But what little we do here is simple and strangely powerful. Aspasia stayed in Athens. She didn't vanish in scandal. She didn't die in disgrace. She wasn't cast out by a city that had once put her on trial. She lived on, not as a symbol or a myth, but as a person. It's believed she later married Lysicles, a lesser-known Athenian general. He was not of Pericles' stature, not a golden figure of the age, but he admired her, perhaps for her mind, or perhaps for the quiet steadiness she had always carried. Some say she helped him rise in politics. Others suggest she simply supported him as he stepped into the turbulent world Pericles had left behind. But again, this part of her life is vague. It was not filled with dramatic moments or tragic downfalls. It was something far less celebrated, but far more human. Survival. Aspasia lived. She lived after the man who changed laws for her had died. She lived after the courts had judged her, after the whispers faded, after the plague had emptied homes and temples. She lived in a city that was no longer golden, no longer certain of itself, a city that had once feared her voice, and now mostly forgot it. There is something quietly extraordinary in that. Not every legacy is carved in marble. Some are passed along in memory, in tone, in the way people speak even centuries later. Aspasia's words did not survive. Her writings, if they ever existed, are lost. But the idea of her, the woman who spoke, who questioned, who taught, never quite disappeared. In the end, she became something rare in the ancient world, a woman who outlived the men around her, not through force or fortune, but through calm persistence. Aspasia did not burn out in brilliance. She did not fall in disgrace. She did not vanish in grief. She simply remained. And in the silence that followed Athens' loudest years, she kept being herself, the outsider who never really left, the voice who once said what no one else dared. Aspasia left no writings behind, no books, no letters, no recorded speeches. Not even a fragment of her own voice has survived. And yet, for centuries, people have kept talking about her, but almost always through the voices of men. What we know of Aspasia doesn't come from her. It comes from those around her, from philosophers, playwrights, and historians, who viewed her through lenses of bias, humor, suspicion, or half-reluctant admiration. She exists in the margins of their work. She's mentioned briefly, often indirectly, often with a raised eyebrow. And perhaps that was the point. Aspasia was not forgotten accidentally. She was forgotten deliberately. Ancient Athens was not a place that recorded the lives of women in detail. Even the most respected Athenian women, those born into noble families, those who bore famous sons, are largely invisible in the historical record. Their names are missing. Their words were not saved. Their ideas, if they had them, were almost always credited to someone else. Aspasia, being a foreigner, a heterera, and an intellectual, was even more vulnerable to erasure. She had no legal protections. She had no place in official records. She didn't fit into any comfortable category of remembrance. She wasn't a wife, a mother of a citizen, or a religious figure. She wasn't official in any way. So when it came time to write the story of Athens, the real story, as told by men, she was gently pushed aside. Not completely erased, of course. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she was left in the footnotes, mentioned with a smirk, treated as gossip, as curiosity, as complication. In Plato's dialogues, she appears briefly, smart, but almost as a joke. In comic plays by Aristophanes, she's turned into a figure of ridicule, blamed for wars, imagined as a seductive sorceress. Even centuries later, in Roman writings, she's remembered not for what she said, but for how she supposedly used her beauty to manipulate powerful men. Over time, Her intelligence became a rumor. Her influence became a scandal. Her name became a question mark. Some modern scholars have asked a different question. What if Aspasia's ideas didn't disappear? They were just renamed. What if some of the rhetorical techniques we associate with Socrates or Pericles were actually learned from her? What if some of the speeches attributed to famous men were shaped by a woman whose name didn't belong in public memory? It wouldn't be the first time. Throughout history, countless women have created behind the scenes. They've written under male names. They've been cited as muses or inspirations rather than thinkers. Their thoughts have been absorbed into the works of fathers, lovers, mentors. Their contributions often survive, just not under their own name. With Aspasia, we can't say for sure. But we can see the shape of absence, the outline where a voice used to be, a woman so influential that Pericles lived with her, loved her, defended her in court, yet whose actual words were never recorded. That kind of silence feels intentional. Athens didn't want Aspasia to disappear completely, but it didn't want her remembered too clearly either. It was easier to turn her into myth, into metaphor, into a symbol of temptation or foreign influence. Easier to keep her in the shadow of greater men, rather than admit that she stood beside them. And so, history remembers her name, but not her voice. We remember that she lived with Pericles, that she spoke with Socrates, that she hosted thinkers in her home. But we do not remember what she thought. That too is a kind of power, because even in that silence, even through centuries of being footnoted, caricatured, and sidelined, Aspasia still echoes, still sparks debate, still refuses to fully vanish. The memory of her survives not because it was preserved, but because it kept coming back. As a question, as a challenge, as a quiet reminder of all the minds history chose not to hear. Aspasia never asked to be remembered. She didn't lead armies or build monuments. She didn't demand power, and she never claimed a title. She simply spoke, thoughtfully, confidently, and, for her time, dangerously. That was enough. In a world where women were praised for being silent, her words were an act of rebellion. In a city where status was everything, her presence, foreign, female, unapproved, was a quiet disruption. She did not fight the system with force. She simply lived beyond its limits. And for that, she paid a quiet price. History often celebrates people who are ahead of their time, but being ahead of your time rarely feels like triumph. More often, it feels like solitude. Aspasia wasn't hailed as a visionary in her lifetime. She wasn't celebrated for her intellect or admired for her independence. She was questioned, accused, diminished, and quietly pushed to the edge of the story. She lived among men who shaped the world, but she was never allowed to shape it openly. Her thoughts had to flow through others, through lovers, students, guests at her table. Her influence was real, but it came without recognition, without protection, without legacy. To survive, she had to walk a careful line, never too visible, never too quiet, too bold, and she would be punished, too passive, and she would be erased. She chose to speak anyway. That choice brought her love. It brought her power. It brought her into the company of thinkers, generals, and orators. But it also brought isolation. Because the higher she rose, in thought, in reputation, in risk, the fewer people stood beside her. Pericles, perhaps, was the exception. He defended her in court. He lived with her despite scandal. He trusted her, listened to her. But even that relationship could not protect her from suspicion. Even that love, strong as it may have been, could not offer her full belonging. She was still not a citizen, still not a wife, still not one of us. And when he died, she was left with the fragments of memory, of whispers, of uncredited ideas. We imagine trailblazers as fearless. Aspasia may not have been. She may have worried. She may have doubted herself. She may have wondered, in quiet moments, whether it was worth it. There were no awards for what she did, no books written in her name, no statues raised in her honor. But she kept going. She continued to speak, to host, to teach, even as the world shifted around her. She watched as wars reshaped borders, as plagues thinned crowds, as politics turned brutal. Through it all, she remained the same, thoughtful, articulate, and profoundly alone in what she represented. Aspasia belonged to no category. She was not a wife, not a priestess, not a citizen, not a slave, not a student, not a teacher, not officially. She was simply herself. And for that, Athens didn't quite know what to do with her. So it remembered her vaguely, uneasily, as a figure of gossip, a whisper of influence, a brilliant woman who said too much, and therefore could not be said too clearly. But even that kind of memory is powerful, because it endures. Thousands of years later, we are still speaking her name, still asking who she was, still wondering what she said, what she thought, what she knew. She never wrote a book, but she became a question. And that, in its own quiet way, is a form of immortality. Aspasia did not get the ending most stories offer. No grand farewell, no tragic fall, no heroic redemption. She was not destroyed, and she was not rewarded. She simply faded, slowly, quietly, like the echo of a voice that once filled a room. But she was there, a woman who dared to speak in a world that asked her to be silent, a mind that lit the corners of rooms she wasn't supposed to enter, a presence that lingered long after the men she influenced had disappeared into history. She was ahead of her time, and like many who are, she walked alone. Aspasia's story is not one of noise or conquest. There are no battles with her name, no laws directly penned by her hand, no surviving works to quote. And yet, she remains, not as a myth, not as a martyr, but as a quiet challenge to the way we remember history. She was a woman without a place in the structures around her, not a citizen, not a wife, not a philosopher, at least not by title. But she moved through Athens with clarity, with thought, with presence. She shaped conversation. She shaped men who shaped empires. And in doing so, she shaped something far more enduring, the idea that intellect has no gender and that influence can exist without permission. History did not know what to do with her, so it blurred her, reduced her, turned her into gossip or worse, a footnote. But even in that distortion, her outline remained. A woman who dared to speak, a mind that refused to dim, a life lived not for glory but for thought. In the end, Aspasia teaches us something simple and profound. You don't need to be loud to be remembered. You only need to be true. And somewhere, in the faded records of ancient Athens, her voice still lingers, soft, persistent, and impossible to silence completely. Falling in love, then getting married, it's a romantic idea, and a relatively modern one. For most of human history, marriage was never about love. It was a practical arrangement, a decision made not by hearts, but by families, economics, and social expectations. If you're imagining two people locking eyes across a marketplace and deciding to spend their lives together, think again. In many ancient societies, such a scenario would be considered suspicious, irrational, even dangerous. For centuries, marriage functioned less like a union of two souls and more like a merger between two households. Decisions were made by parents, elders, and clan leaders. In many cases, the bride and groom had no say in the matter at all. It was not uncommon for a couple to meet for the first time on their wedding day, sometimes even during the ceremony itself. Love wasn't just irrelevant, it was often seen as a disruptive force that could threaten family strategy or political stability. In many cultures, particularly in agrarian or aristocratic societies, marriage was a tool. It maintained bloodlines, secured alliances, protected property, and ensured continuity. A daughter's hand in marriage could bring cattle, land, or favor. A son's marriage could mean the expansion of territory or social rank. Emotions? Those were for poetry, not contracts. Love, when it did show up, was seen as something dangerous and irrational. Romantic desire was often viewed with suspicion, especially if it challenged the arranged order of things. A son who fell in love with someone unsuitable could be disinherited. A daughter who tried to marry for love could be cast out. Families feared that personal feelings might weaken the power of marriage as a social institution, so instead, they did their best to keep love out of the equation entirely. Even the idea of compatibility didn't carry much weight. What mattered was the status of the family, the dowry or bride price, and whether the marriage served its intended function. Did the bride's family have good farmland? Did the groom's clan need allies in the neighboring village? That was the basis for a match. Emotional closeness, attraction, shared interests, those weren't part of the checklist. In some traditions, it was even believed that love could grow only after marriage, if at all, and that duty came first. And it wasn't just about obedience to family. Many people were conditioned from childhood to see marriage as a duty, not a dream. Girls were raised to become good wives and mothers. Boys were taught to carry on the family line and protect property. From early ages, they were told that love was not their concern, that it was something separate from the adult responsibilities of marriage and household management. In some societies, women were married off as soon as they were biologically capable of bearing children, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. These were not relationships between equal partners with mutual understanding, but legal arrangements with expectations attached. Consent, as we think of it today, was rarely even discussed. It was assumed that the family's decision was final. Religious and legal structures reinforced these norms. Marriage was a rite of passage, not an emotional choice. In many legal codes, a woman's value was tied to her marital status and her ability to produce legitimate heirs. Love had no role to play in that formula. Even in religious texts, while marriage was praised as sacred, love was often a side note, something idealized perhaps, but not necessary. What's more, stories of tragic love, like Romeo and Juliet, Tristan and Isolde, or Layla and Majnun, became popular not because they celebrated happy unions, but because they highlighted the chaos that happened when people dared to love outside the rules. These weren't love stories with happy endings, they were warnings. So when we look back at marriage throughout history, we need to remove our modern lens. The idea that two people would choose each other out of affection, compatibility, and shared dreams, that's a fairly new invention. In most times and places, marriage was a strategic decision. Love was optional at best, and the heart was not consulted. Of course, not all marriages were loveless. Human beings are complex. Affection could grow, kindness could develop, but the fact remains, love was never the foundation. It was a luxury, sometimes an accident, and often a risk. If you think marriage was once a sacred romantic bond between two people, think again. In the past, getting married was less about feelings and more about finances, land, alliances, and survival. In many ways, it was like signing a business deal, one negotiated, calculated, and sealed not with a kiss, but with terms and conditions. Love was optional, a proper dowry was not. Marriage, especially in ancient and medieval societies, served the same purpose as a trade agreement. Two families, not two individuals, came to the table. They brought offers, expectations, and assets. The bride and groom were the human components of a larger transaction. If both sides agreed, the deal was on. If not, negotiations continued. Romantic attraction had very little to do with it, if it played a role at all. The key players in this deal, parents, uncles, elders, sometimes even political or religious leaders. The bride and groom were often silent participants, especially if they were young, which, in many cases, they were. Marriages were arranged by adults who understood the social and economic benefits of linking two families. The goal wasn't happiness, it was security, power, or prosperity. So, what exactly was being negotiated? Everything. The size of the dowry, the land that would be transferred, the status of each family, the responsibilities of both parties. In some cultures, the groom's family had to pay a bride price, a symbolic or literal sum to compensate the bride's family. In others, the bride's family gave dowries of goods, money, or livestock. The more valuable the bride, the higher the cost, not because of her personality, but because of what her family could offer. Marriage contracts were sometimes written down, especially among nobility or in more bureaucratic societies. These contracts could include detailed lists of who owed what, how disputes would be handled, and even contingency plans in case of infertility or death. In essence, it was a prenup, just not for love, but for survival. There were cases where the bride and groom didn't even meet until the wedding day, or worse, didn't recognize each other even after. It didn't matter. As long as the families had agreed, as long as the resources were transferred, the union was considered valid. If one side didn't meet their end of the bargain, it could lead to feuds, dishonor, or even the annulment of the marriage. In aristocratic and royal circles, these deals weren't just about land or wealth, they were about political power. Marrying off a daughter to the right noble family could secure military alliances, end rivalries, or claim foreign territories. In such cases, the wedding ceremony was essentially a diplomatic summit. The couple getting married, often pawns in a much larger game. Among commoners, the scale was smaller, but the logic was the same. A marriage could bring an extra pair of hands to work the land, a small plot of inherited field, or access to new markets. A poor family might marry off a daughter just to reduce the number of mouths to feed. A wealthy family might demand a higher bride price to reflect their status. Marriage was not just personal, it was economic strategy. And once the deal was finalized, the wedding took place. But even the ceremony was more about formalizing the contract than celebrating affection. Rituals served to publicly acknowledge the transfer of assets and obligations. Witnesses were present not to enjoy the event, but to confirm its legality. A feast might follow, but it was less about love, more about sealing the transaction. So, yes, in the past, getting married really was like doing business. It wasn't about soulmates. It was about survival, structure, and securing one's place in a very uncertain world. The heart wasn't consulted, the ledger was. Today, the idea of someone getting married at 12 years old sounds shocking, even horrifying. But for much of human history, especially in pre-modern societies, this wasn't just normal. It was expected. In many cultures, children were considered ready for marriage not when they matured emotionally, but when they reached biological markers like puberty, or sometimes, even earlier, based on economic or social pressures. For girls, this often meant being married off between the ages of 12 and 14. In poorer families, or in times of hardship, it could happen even earlier. A girl's value in the marriage market was frequently tied to her youth and fertility. The sooner she could bear children, the sooner she could start fulfilling her purpose, producing heirs, helping with domestic work, and forming alliances through childbirth. Boys, too, were pushed into early marriage. While they were sometimes older than the girls they married, many boys entered into marriage before they had any real understanding of adulthood. If they were physically able to work and socially recognized as capable of leading a household, that was enough. Love, consent, and emotional readiness were not part of the equation. Why such early marriages? The reasons were practical, not personal. Life expectancy was shorter. Infant mortality was high. People didn't have the luxury of waiting until their mid-20s to find themselves or date around. Marriage was a duty, and delaying it was often seen as irresponsible. The moment a girl could menstruate, or a boy could labor, they were ready to become husband and wife, at least in the eyes of their community. Economic necessity played a big role too. In struggling families, marrying off a daughter meant one less mouth to feed, and possibly the gain of a small dowry. In wealthy households, marrying young secured alliances before political landscapes could shift. Either way, the personal desires of the child were rarely considered. In some regions, especially where patriarchal norms were strongest, a girl's early marriage was tied to protecting her honor. Keeping her unmarried for too long risked scandal or gossip. A girl was seen as a burden and a potential liability. The longer she remained single, marriage was considered a safeguard, even if she was still playing with dolls. There were cases where girls as young as 10 or 11 were promised in marriage, though the actual union might be delayed a few years. In practice, however, consummation often occurred soon after the wedding ceremony, regardless of the girl's physical or psychological readiness. This wasn't just traumatic, it was institutionalized. And let's not romanticize this. These were not fairy tale weddings. There were no slow dances or candlelight dinners. For many children, marriage meant leaving home, serving strangers, bearing children, and adapting to adult responsibilities overnight. Some girls died from childbirth complications because their bodies weren't ready. Some boys were crushed under the expectations of becoming men before they ever had the chance to be boys. This practice wasn't limited to one region or religion. From medieval Europe to ancient Asia, from tribal Africa to feudal Latin America, child marriage was a global reality. It wasn't questioned. It was culture, it was custom, and it was survival, for better or worse. To modernize, it's easy to judge, but for people in those times, it was simply how things were. Childhood, as we know it today, didn't really exist. It wasn't a protected time for growth, exploration, or self-discovery. It was a brief pause between being born and being put to work or married off. So when we look at history and wonder how people survived such harsh conditions, the answer is often they didn't, or they did, but they grew up too fast, too soon. They became wives and husbands before they ever got to be children, and in many cases, they never had a choice. You might think weddings today are expensive, the dresses, the catering, the flowers, the Instagram-worthy venue. But in the past, weddings could be just as financially crushing, and in many cases, even worse. Not because of luxury or personal choice, but because weddings were seen as public declarations of status, wealth, and family honor. A single wedding could stretch an entire household, even a whole extended family, to the edge of bankruptcy. Back then, weddings weren't just family events. They were community spectacles. A marriage wasn't a private matter between two people. It was a social contract between clans, and everyone was watching. If your family didn't show up in full force, with gifts, processions, food, and celebration, you risked humiliation. The pressure to perform was immense. For the bride's family, the burden was especially heavy. In many cultures, they were expected to provide a dowry, a package of wealth, land, livestock, or household items that would go with the bride into her new home. This dowry wasn't just symbolic, it was a negotiation tool, a proof of the family's status, and often a literal investment into the groom's household. The richer the family, the more extravagant the dowry had to be, not out of generosity, but out of obligation. You couldn't offer a few goats and expect your daughter to marry into an elite family. No, you needed land, jewels, or even servants. And if you didn't have those things, you borrowed, you sold valuables, you went into debt, because your family's reputation depended on it. The groom's side also had expectations to meet. In some traditions, they had to host the entire village for the wedding feast. That meant food, drink, music, clothing, and sometimes even accommodations for guests who traveled from afar. The groom himself might have to present gifts not only to the bride, but to her relatives, a practice known in some cultures as bride price. If either side failed to meet these social standards, it could have long-term consequences. Rumors, social exclusion, fewer marriage offers for younger siblings. The wedding wasn't just a party, it was a performance, and the audience was your community. Poor families suffered the most. For them, marrying off a daughter could be financially devastating. Even modest dowries required savings, trade-offs, or community help. Some families would sell land or animals to afford the ceremony. Others would save for years, not for the daughter's future education or happiness, but for one day of public display. The irony? That same daughter might be sent to a difficult marriage, but at least she had a respectable send-off. In some places, the stress didn't end with the wedding. Families were expected to continue providing support, gifts on anniversaries, contributions during childbirth, and sometimes regular goods like food or cloth. Marriage created an ongoing economic relationship between families. It wasn't a one-time transaction, it was a long-term investment. And remember, all of this happened in societies where there was no credit card, no wedding loan, no payment plans. Families had to sacrifice real assets, crops, jewelry, savings, just to meet expectations. And if they couldn't, they risked shame, gossip, or broken arrangements. Of course, not every wedding was extravagant. Among the very poor, some weddings were minimal, just enough to be considered legitimate. But even then, the emotional and social pressure remained. You might not be able to afford a feast, but you still had to save face. So while modern weddings may feel stressful, they often come with choice. You can elope, scale back, skip the formalities. In the past, that wasn't an option. A wedding was a test of honor, pride, and sacrifice. Families didn't just marry off their children, they put everything on the table. In modern times, marriage often means two people starting a life together, perhaps in their own apartment, a small rented place, or a home built just for two. privacy is expected. Independence is assumed. But in the past, especially in traditional societies, marriage didn't take you to your own cozy space. It took you straight into your husband's family home, a crowded, hierarchical, and often hostile environment. And no, you didn't get a say. The idea of just the two of us didn't exist. After the wedding, the bride moved into the groom's household, often a multi-generational home filled with parents, grandparents, siblings, cousins, and possibly even hired workers. This wasn't a temporary setup. It was the expected, permanent arrangement. A new wife wasn't starting a new life. She was joining someone else's. There was no honeymoon, no romantic getaway, no time to adjust. From the first day, the bride had to fit into a system that had existed long before her, a system where she was at the very bottom of the ladder. Her new reality included not only a husband she might barely know, but a mother-in-law with full authority, sisters-in-law with opinions, and a household with strict, unspoken rules. In many cultures, the mother-in-law was the true matriarch, the one who managed the home and had control over the new bride's daily routine. If she was kind, life could be tolerable. If she was harsh, it could be miserable. The new wife had to prove herself through obedience, hard work, and silence. There was little room for personal expression, let alone complaints. Privacy? That was a luxury. The concept of having your own room didn't apply. The bride might sleep in a shared space, cook for a dozen people, and perform chores from dawn until nightfall. Every move was watched. Every action was judged. She had to adjust quickly or risk being labeled lazy, disrespectful, or, worst of all, a bad wife. And there was no escape. Divorce was rare, especially for women, and returning to her family was often not an option. Once married, she was considered part of her husband's clan, no longer fully belonging to her birth family. Even if she was mistreated, the social expectation was that she would endure quietly. A woman's ability to suffer in silence was seen as a virtue. In some societies, newlywed women were even forbidden from speaking freely in the home for a period of time. They were expected to listen, observe, and learn. This wasn't a relationship of equals. It was a slow initiation into servitude. Being a good daughter-in-law became a full-time job, one that offered no salary, no days off, and no retirement plan. Relationships with other women in the household could be tense. Sisters-in-law might compete for favor. Older women might assert dominance. The household could feel less like a family and more like a minefield. Every interaction had to be managed carefully. One wrong word could spark gossip, conflict, or punishment. As for the husband, his support varied. Some were kind, others were indifferent. In many cases, the husband's loyalty leaned toward his mother or elder siblings, especially in his early years. Love, if it came at all, had to grow in the shadow of a crowded house, under constant observation, without private time or emotional space. The modern idea of starting a life together didn't apply. You didn't start anything. You adapted. You submitted. You survived. So next time you imagine the good old days of traditional marriage, picture this: a young girl, far from home, surrounded by strangers, learning to cook meals she's never tasted, memorizing rules no one explains, and being judged every moment. That was the beginning of her married life. And it wasn't a love story. It was a survival story. Today, when a marriage turns toxic or painful, people have options: counseling, separation, divorce. These are seen as difficult, but acceptable paths. But for most of history, marriage was not a contract you could leave. It was a lifelong sentence, sealed by culture, religion, and law. No matter how unhappy you were, how badly you were treated, or how much you cried at night, you stayed. Divorce was either impossible, illegal, or considered a shame worse than death. In many societies, ending a marriage was not just frowned upon, it was scandalous. It brought disgrace not only to the couple, but to their entire families. A divorced woman, in particular, could become a social outcast. She was seen as damaged, difficult, or even morally corrupt, regardless of the reason for the separation. In patriarchal systems, which were nearly universal in the ancient and medieval world, only men had the legal and social right to initiate divorce. And even when that option existed, it wasn't always exercised. A man might simply abandon his wife without legal process, while she had no way to leave him. Her status, safety, and survival were all tied to staying, no matter the cost to her well-being. For women, the lack of freedom was especially harsh. Once married, a woman had very few rights. She could not easily return to her parents' home. She could not remarry. She could not start over. Her life, her entire identity, was bound to her husband's. Even if he was violent, neglectful, or unfaithful, she was expected to endure. Suffering in silence was considered virtuous. Physical abuse, tolerated or hidden, emotional cruelty, not even recognized as a problem. There were no shelters, no legal protection, no support systems. Religious and moral teachings often encouraged women to be obedient, patient, and forgiving, as if perseverance would eventually be rewarded. But many women died waiting for that reward. There were exceptions, of course. Some ancient cultures allowed for divorce under strict conditions. But even then, the process was complex, shameful, and often stacked against the wife. In many places, a man could cast his wife aside with a word, while a woman needed to prove extreme cases of abuse, abandonment, or infertility, and even then, she might still be denied. The consequences for divorced women were severe. They were often viewed as failed wives or cursed individuals. Some were forced to return to their birth families in disgrace. Others ended up in poverty or prostitution. Remarriage was difficult, sometimes forbidden. Society offered little mercy for women who couldn't make it work. And what about emotional fulfillment? Romance? Joy? These were luxuries, not expectations. Most marriages were built on duty, not affection. If love blossomed, it was accidental. If it didn't, you learned to live with it or without it. You were married, and that was that. Many people stayed in painful marriages because they had no alternative. They had children. They had no money of their own. They were afraid of judgment. The idea of leaving for your happiness would have sounded selfish, even absurd. Happiness wasn't the point. Survival was. This reality wasn't exclusive to one culture or one time period. From feudal Europe to ancient Asia, from tribal Africa to the Islamic and Christian worlds, marriage was forever. Not in a poetic, fairy tale way, but in a binding, inescapable way. So while modern relationships still face challenges, it's worth remembering this. In the past, many people weren't choosing to stay in unhappy marriages. They were trapped in them. Behind every "till death do us part" vow, there was often a quiet desperation, a silent grief, and a lifetime of tears no one ever acknowledged. Marriage was forever, even when it hurt. In the past, marriage wasn't about companionship, passion, or emotional growth. It had one clear, measurable goal: produce children. The more, the better. And not just any children, preferably sons, because a marriage without offspring wasn't just disappointing, it was considered a failure. Having children wasn't a personal milestone, it was a social duty. From the moment a woman was married, often as a teenager, sometimes even younger, the expectation was immediate. Conceive, give birth, repeat. Her value in the household, her status in the community, and even her personal worth were directly tied to how many children she could produce and how fast she could do it. Sons were especially prized. In many patriarchal societies, daughters were seen as temporary members of the family, destined to marry out and belong to another household. Sons, on the other hand, stayed. They carried the family name, inherited land, worked the fields, defended the home, and cared for parents in old age. A son was an investment. A daughter was a future expense. This obsession with male heirs was deeply woven into tradition, religion, and economics. In some places, prayers were offered specifically for the birth of a boy. In others, women who bore only daughters were pitied or blamed. There were cases where a woman's position in the household declined with every daughter she delivered. Some were replaced, divorced, or pushed aside in favor of more fertile or luckier wives. Infertility, real or assumed, was one of the worst fates for a married woman. A childless marriage was rarely seen as a mutual issue. The blame almost always fell on the woman. regardless of the truth. She might face humiliation, isolation, or even abandonment. In extreme cases, she could be sent back to her parents in shame, labeled barren, useless, or cursed. But the pressure didn't stop with just one child. No, a single son wasn't enough. Infant mortality rates were high, and life expectancy was short. Families wanted many children, both for security and for survival. The more sons, the better your chances of passing down land, protecting property, and preserving lineage. Children were laborers, soldiers, caretakers, your insurance plan, your workforce, and your legacy. Women were expected to give birth over and over again, often with little rest, poor nutrition, and no medical care. Childbirth was dangerous, not just once, but every single time. Maternal death was common, and many women died young, worn down by the sheer number of pregnancies. But stopping wasn't an option. Producing children, especially boys, was what made you a good wife. Love for the child wasn't the primary focus. Parenting as we understand it today, nurturing emotional development, encouraging individuality, wasn't a major concern. Children were born into roles, not raised for self-fulfillment. Boys were trained to inherit, girls to obey, and later reproduce. You didn't raise a child, you prepared a future adult. For men, fatherhood was often about legacy and numbers. A successful man had many sons, and, in wealthier households, possibly many wives or concubines to help produce them. For women, motherhood was identity. To not become a mother was to be invisible. And yet, despite all of this pressure, choice was absent. No one asked the young bride if she wanted children, how many, or when. Her body was never really her own. It was a vessel for fertility, for family pride, for future generations. There was no discussion, no planning. There was only expectation. So, when people today romanticize historical marriage, the simpler times, the traditional roles, they often forget what was demanded, especially from women. Marriage meant childbirth, repeatedly, relentlessly. And if those children weren't boys, the pressure only grew heavier. To marry was to bear, and to bear meant proving your worth, one painful delivery at a time. When we picture a wedding today, the image is clear: a flowing white dress, romantic music, vows exchanged under a floral arch, and maybe a slow dance under fairy lights. But for most of human history, weddings looked nothing like this. There was no white dress, no diamond ring, no choreographed first dance. A wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a formal acknowledgement of an agreement, serious, structured, and deeply symbolic, but rarely sentimental. The idea of a white wedding is a modern invention. White gowns didn't become popular until the 19th century, after Queen Victoria wore one in 1840. Before that, brides simply wore their best clothes, regardless of colour. In poorer communities, this might mean a clean dress used for other ceremonies, or even everyday clothing with a few added decorations. Silk and lace were luxuries for the elite. Most people walked down the aisle, if there was one, in linen, wool, or whatever the family could afford. And forget about long guest lists and flower arrangements. Ancient and medieval weddings were often small, solemn, and efficient. Especially among lower classes, the goal was to make the marriage official, not magical. Ceremonies were rooted in religion, custom, or local law, and once the key rituals were performed, the couple was married. That was it. There were no vows written from the heart. No speeches about soulmates. Often, the bride and groom barely knew each other. In some cultures, the ceremony took place in the home, not a religious building. In others, a public square or village centre was used, partly to allow witnesses, and partly to show the community that the marriage was valid. Witnesses were essential. Their job wasn't to clap or cry, it was to confirm the transaction had taken place. The union wasn't just spiritual, it was legal, and it needed proof. The rituals themselves varied, but they usually included symbolic acts of transfer. The bride might be handed from her father to the groom, symbolizing the movement of ownership or guardianship. Gifts or dowries were often exchanged right there. Livestock, textiles, coins, tools, making the moment feel less like a fairy tale and more like a business deal. Some ceremonies included solemn blessings or prayers, asking for fertility, health, and long life, but even those were delivered with reverence, not romance. There was little room for laughter or spontaneity. Smiling too much might even be seen as inappropriate. A wedding was a sacred rite, not an emotional performance. And what came after the ceremony? Reality. In many cases, the bride went straight to her husband's home that same day, sometimes even immediately. There was no honeymoon, no hotel suite, no time to relax. Her new life began, cooking, cleaning, obeying, under the watchful eyes of her in-laws. The ceremony might have been short, but the consequences lasted a lifetime. Among the wealthy, things were more elaborate, but still followed the same logic. Nobles held feasts, displayed wealth, and paraded their unions with music and banners. But again, the purpose was not love. It was political theatre. A marriage meant new alliances, stronger claims, and more power. The bride's dress might be embroidered, but her future had already been written. Modern wedding culture, the decorations, the tears, the personalized vows, is built on the idea that marriage is a celebration of love. But for most of history, marriage was a duty, and the ceremony reflected that. It wasn't about the individual, it was about the family, the community, and the system that needed to keep turning. So no, there were no white dresses, no Instagram photos, no couple dancing to their favorite song, just two people standing in a public space, bound together by ritual, tradition, and expectation. And then, life began. In many modern relationships, fidelity is expected. Monogamy is part of the promise. When a partner cheats, it's considered a betrayal of love, of trust, of equality. But in most of human history, the rules were different. Not because people didn't care about loyalty, but because those rules weren't applied equally. In traditional marriages, men often had freedom, and women paid the price. Let's be blunt. Male infidelity was tolerated, even accepted, in many ancient societies. It wasn't considered ideal, but it wasn't shocking either. Husbands, especially wealthy or powerful ones, were expected to have mistresses, lovers, or concubines. In fact, having multiple women was often seen as a symbol of status. A man with 10 children from 5 women was not immoral. He was successful. Concubines weren't secret affairs. They were socially recognized secondary wives, women who lived with the man but didn't have the same legal standing as his official wife. They could bear children, manage households, even wield influence, but they were always beneath the primary wife in status. Still, the very existence of concubines made one thing clear: men were allowed more. Women, however, had no such freedom. A married woman was expected to be completely loyal, both in body and reputation. If she was even suspected of cheating or behaving inappropriately, the consequences could be severe. She might be beaten, divorced, publicly shamed, or even executed, depending on the society and the era. Her word rarely mattered. Her innocence wasn't assumed. This wasn't just about morality. It was about property and paternity. A man needed to be certain that his children were biologically his, especially if they were going to inherit land, wealth, or titles. A wife's fidelity wasn't just about honor. It was about lineage control. That's why the double standard was so firmly enforced. Women lived under constant surveillance. Their freedom was limited, their behavior scrutinized. In some cultures, wives were physically secluded from men outside the family. In others, they were expected to cover their bodies, avoid eye contact, and never speak first. It wasn't just about modesty, it was about control. And yet, men could visit prostitutes, keep mistresses, and spend nights away from home without fear of punishment. If a wife questioned it, she might be seen as jealous or disrespectful. Her role was to endure, not object. Some women, of course, found ways to rebel. There are rare stories of secret lovers, hidden children, or escape. But these were exceptions, not the norm. Most women had no real choice. Even if they hated their husband, even if they were neglected, mistreated, or humiliated, they stayed because they had nowhere else to go. And the injustice wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was embedded in the structure of society. There were no protests, no headlines, no revolutions over it. Just countless women living out their lives in systems where faithfulness was demanded of them, but not returned. Even the emotional double standards were cruel. A husband might fall in love with another woman, shower her with affection, give her gifts, and praise her beauty, all while his wife was expected to remain silent, raise his children, and manage his household. Her heartbreak was invisible. Her dignity was negotiable. Today, we talk about equality in marriage, emotional, legal, sexual. But for most of history, marriage was a one-sided contract where women gave everything and received limits. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the rules around fidelity. So when we romanticize the past, the loyalty, the tradition, the simpler times, we should remember this. Many women stayed faithful, not because they were cherished, but because they had no right not to be. We often romanticize the past. Soft candlelight, handwritten letters, dramatic love stories whispered through time. But the truth about marriage in ancient and pre-modern societies is far less poetic. It was not a story of love, it was a structure of survival. For most of human history, marriage was never about happily ever after. It was about duty, family, and function. Marriage was a contract between families, not lovers. It decided alliances, land, inheritance, and status. The bride and groom were participants, but rarely the authors of their story. The decisions were made by others. The terms were non-negotiable. The system valued obedience over affection and tradition over personal happiness. Love was not just absent, it was often seen as a threat. To choose a spouse based on desire could upend family strategy, cause social scandal, or disrupt carefully planned exchanges of wealth and power. In many cultures, love was for songs and poems, not for real life. From marrying at 12, to living under the roof of strangers, to bearing children until your body broke, the ancient experience of marriage, especially for women, was deeply rooted in sacrifice. A woman's worth was measured in her fertility, her silence, and her ability to serve. Her personal dreams, if she had any, were buried beneath generations of expectation. Meanwhile, men held the power. They could take lovers, remarry, or discard wives with little consequence. The system was unequal by design, and that injustice was rarely questioned. It was simply how the world worked. Weddings weren't fairy tales either. No white dress, no romantic gestures. The ceremony was a transaction, solemn, symbolic, and often stressful. Families went into debt just to maintain appearances. Entire households were judged based on how well a daughter was married off, or how powerful a union could become. And yet, for all this pressure, marriage was permanent. Divorce was nearly impossible, and social disgrace loomed for anyone who tried to escape. People stayed in loveless, even abusive marriages, not out of loyalty, but because they had no choice. Marriage was a life sentence, even if it came with heartbreak, even if it came with tears. Children were not the result of love, but the proof of duty. A childless marriage was seen as broken, a marriage without sons as cursed. Parenthood was not about nurturing identities, it was about producing heirs. Women bore the burden, literally, repeatedly, often until death. And in all of this, the emotional injustice ran deep. A woman could be faithful, kind, and devoted, and still be replaced, overlooked, or abused. Her suffering was invisible. Her endurance was expected. Her voice, unheard. So what can we learn from this? We learn that modern ideas of love, partnership, and emotional equality are radical inventions, not ancient norms. We learn to value the right to choose, to love freely, to leave when necessary. And most of all, we learn that traditional marriage wasn't always noble. Often, it was simply inhumane. Marriage today isn't perfect, but compared to the past, it is a revolution. A space where love can matter, where partnership can be equal, and where no one is trapped by duty alone. Let's not forget how far we've come, and let's never take that freedom for granted.